All right, folks. Well, we're just 3 minutes after the bottom of the hour. So in the spirit of staying on time today, because we have a ton of great content for you, we'll go ahead and we'll kick off this episode of Datadog On. So officially welcome to Datadog On, the lifecycle of threats and vulnerabilities. Datadog On is a series where we invite engineers working at Datadog to talk to us about a specific technology or an interesting engineering problem that we're trying to solve inside Datadog. The recordings for this will be available, of course, after the session on datadoghq.com. A few housekeeping items, though, before we start. This is a live event, and I'd absolutely love for you to interact with us as we walk through the session today. If you want to say hi and let us know where you're coming in from, that's great. If you want to ask a question, use that Q&A feature in Zoom to ask a question, and I'll do my best to keep an eye on those and surface questions to our speakers, who will introduce themselves here shortly. If you're not familiar with Datadog, though, Datadog is a monitoring and analytics platform that helps companies improve their observability across their infrastructure and applications. And recently, we've also expanded into the security space, which is, of course, the focus of our session today. I'm Andrew Krug. I lead the Security Advocacy team at Datadog, which is a part of Technical Community. And there's how you can find me on social. And I'm joined today by Nick Frichette. Nick is a senior security researcher specializing in AWS offensive security. Give him a wave, Nick.
Hey, everyone.
And where are you joining us from today, Nick?
I'm in Bloomington, Illinois, which is about 2 hours south of Chicago.
Great. And Adam Stevko is joining us as well. Adam is a security engineer working in the platform security area. And where are you joining us from today, Adam?
Hello, I'm joining from Barcelona, Spain.
Awesome. So in just a minute here, Nick is going to kick off the first portion of the Datadog On session. We're going to talk about just what do we mean when we actually say threats and vulnerabilities, because I think one of the things that's most confusing across the industry is we all define these things a little teeny bit differently, and that makes it really hard coming from the outside of security sometimes to understand exactly what someone is talking about. Wouldn't you say that's true, Nick?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Andrew. Yeah, before we get started, we should probably take the time to actually define those terms before we get into how we identify threats and vulnerabilities across cloud environments, and then how Datadog scales to mitigate those potential issues. For starting off pretty simply, a vulnerability is any kind of weakness in a system. And you can think of these as enablement an adversary. This enables an attacker to do something that they probably shouldn't be able to do. Next, a threat is simply any event that can cause damage to your organization. If you've ever seen InfoSec marketing material before, I'm sure you're familiar with the stereotypical bad guy in a dark basement with a hoodie on, but threats come in all sorts of varieties with different goals and objectives that they're interested in. And next we have risk, which is the potential for loss. When you combine a vulnerability and a threat, you have the potential for a breach or other security incident. And here we see just a few examples of each of those categories. As a research organization at Datadog, our goal is to continuously monitor and research both threats and vulnerabilities, identifying where those two may intersect and how they can potentially impact an organization. And so at Datadog, there are a couple of key areas of research that we focus on. And we use this research to not only protect Datadog's internal security, but also to protect our customers and improve our security products. To dive into some of these topics at a high level and how they can potentially impact your environment, let's start with threat research, which is a major topic here at Datadog. We are constantly tracking adversaries and their activities. And this takes the form of being mindful and identifying attacker infrastructure, their IP addresses, domains, and infrastructure that they host attacks from, as well as their TTPs, their tactics, their techniques, and their procedures. So what behaviors do they exhibit? What types of attacks do they perform? What is their playbook, essentially? As well as what malware do they produce? And of course, by reversing it, what can we learn about their attack patterns? And finally, we're very mindful about, in the event that an attacker succeeds in a campaign, they get some sort of intrusion, they gain access to data, what can they use from that to then go attack other targets? So trying to use that as a means of identifying where adversaries are going or what they now have access to. Another major target for, or a major topic of research for the team is supply chain security research. Unfortunately, as you can see from the diagram, there are a number of different areas where an attacker may try and compromise or abuse a supply chain. And from each of those locations, we try to identify what an attacker may achieve by compromising that, or what potential defenses could be in place to mitigate that issue.
I think what's interesting about this diagram here, Nick, is that this actually shows that supply chain security and vulnerabilities and threats related to supply chain security are through the entire code build and deployment process. I think when we talk about this outside, we only talk about the dependency part of it, really just like third-party risk. So I'm just wondering from your perspective, like going back to those definitions, like which is this? Is it a threat or is it a vulnerability?
No, that's a really good question. I think in particular, this would be more example of a threat. There are threats that might target any of these potential, I suppose we call them paths or opportunities for a potential threat actor. Although, as a part of this, they may attempt to insert a vulnerability into a package or a library that further down the chain, when it's used in an application, that might enable them to abuse the application in some way, maybe getting code execution or stealing sensitive data. Through this research, we've made a number of contributions to the community. Most notably, we have an open source project called GuardDog, which is a tool to try and identify malicious PyPI packages via various heuristics. And from this research actually resulted in the team finding a backdoored library called FastAPI Toolkit, which was a totally normal library used to interact with FastAPI, but unfortunately at a point in time, through some means, an adversary was able to actually backdoor that library. And then from then, if you used it in your application, that backdoor would allow an adversary to execute arbitrary code on the host. So by being proactive in this research, we can potentially identify compromised or backdoored packages before they're even pushed out to production.
I heard that's also getting NPM support soon.
It is. That's on the roadmap. It should be done soon. And we're trying to cover a lot of the major package distributors. Next, getting a little bit out of the sort of threat realm and a little bit more into the vulnerability space. Another major topic for research at Datadog is in workload vulnerabilities, the traditional types of vulnerabilities that might exist in the software that you deploy or the applications that you build. For us, it's also important to not only identify what a vulnerability does and how it works, but also what the implications are in a type of environment. So as an example, server-side request forgery, or SSRF, is a common web application vulnerability. And what it allows you to do as an attacker is coerce or trick an application into making a request to some other service. Now, historically, this is used for things like enumeration and reconnaissance of the network that the application is hosted on. However, in a cloud context, this vulnerability behaves just a little bit differently. A lot of the major cloud service providers expose credentials to their VM, whatever their VM offering is, over network requests. And so in a cloud environment, server-side request forgery can be used as a means of stealing API credentials off of a VM and then using them remotely. And so for us, when we build detections and we look at the potential attack paths an adversary has, it's important to be mindful of what may exist in the environment and how an adversary might abuse that in order to gain access to resources or escalate privileges and things like that. Additionally, we're very, very interested in, of course, the sort of big name vulnerabilities that gain popularity within the community or are particularly noteworthy. I think the most recent example of this was the OpenSSL Punycode vulnerability that originally came out as a critical. It was it was all over InfoSec Twitter, and folks were sort of worried about it. But through careful analysis of the vulnerability and releasing proof of concepts and really exploring it, we came to understand that it wasn't quite as significant as the original hype would have us believe. But through this research, it allows us to sort of cut through a lot of that hype and identify what the actual impact is and what it would actually enable an adversary to do. So we're very mindful of these big name, super hyped up vulnerabilities. Next, we get into some of the cloud misconfigurations that might be out there. Cloud service providers are great because they offer a wide variety of services that you can use to build your applications, build your services and whatnot. The challenge, of course, though, is that in order to offer all of those different services and the different configurations, unfortunately, some of them might be considered insecure or might be a risk if you misconfigure them a certain way. So I think the most common example out there is, of course, the concept of the public S3 bucket. There's certainly totally valid reasons for why you might want to make an S3 bucket public, particularly if you're trying to distribute something to the internet at large. But unfortunately, that same configuration that lets you do that allows you to potentially expose resources that you don't want to, such as some of the headlines seen here. And so with cloud providers releasing ever more services and developers hungry to use them, we have to constantly evaluate new services as they come out, as well as updates to old services and how they might be exposed or they might be misconfigured in such a way that they become insecure. And from that, how do we notify internal teams at Datadog or external customers as well to ensure that they have the best chance to remediate those misconfigurations before something happens? Next, another major target, particularly for me in cloud security research, is on attack techniques. And this one might sound a little bit strange if you're not super in depth on sort of incident response or handling. When an attacker goes after an environment, they typically have to perform a number of behaviors in order to achieve some objective. They're not simply just chaining vulnerabilities together. They often have to enumerate privileges or resources. They may attempt to escalate privileges and things like that. Each of those behaviors may be able to be fingerprinted. And from that, we may be able to develop detection rules to identify that behavior in the future. So to give you a real world example of this, like I mentioned in cloud environments, server-side request forgery is a common vulnerability that is exploited by adversaries in order to steal API credentials from a VM. In AWS specifically, attackers use server-side request forgery to steal metadata credentials, IAM credentials from the metadata service, and then they use them locally in order to interact with the AWS API. Now, AWS has a service called GuardDuty, which is a managed threat detection service that alerts and detects common cloud security issues. And of course, because this is such a common thing, they have a rule for what they call instance credential exfiltration. If you steal IAM creds off an EC2 instance, try to use them remotely, this alert will trigger. Now, as you can imagine, as an attacker, this is definitely suboptimal. You don't want to get caught by a built-in detection rule, especially on a technique that is so common and easy to use. So as you might imagine, an adversary may try to bypass this detection through some means. And thanks to research from members of the Datadog security team, we've identified that indeed there is a way to bypass this detection rule, and it allows you to use stolen IAM creds without triggering this GuardDuty alert. Now from this, because we've identified a potential avenue to bypass that detection, we now know that, hey, this is a technique adversaries might attempt to use. And from that, we can fingerprint certain parts of it or certain behaviors that are exhibited by using this technique. And now we'll know going forward that if we see this, this might be an indicator that an attacker is trying to subvert detection. And this is one of the benefits of doing proactive offensive security research. Rather than waiting for an adversary to exhibit this behavior in the wild, we can proactively identify techniques and behaviors that attackers will try to use. And from there, we can build those detections before an attacker can even try to use them. Next up, another major topic for our security research team is the concept of cloud service provider vulnerabilities. So far, everything we've discussed is very heavily on the customer side of the shared responsibility model. Most cloud providers have some variant of this. In the slide here is AWS's shared responsibility model, although they're roughly the same between them. What the shared responsibility model states is that the customer is responsible for the security in the cloud. So the services that you deploy, the applications that you deploy, and the configuration of the cloud assets are the responsibility of the customer. On the other side is the responsibility for the security of the cloud. So the underlying infrastructure, the different service APIs and whatnot, even the physical data centers are all the responsibility of the cloud service provider. Now, as you can imagine, as we are doing research on the customer side of that equation, understanding how these services work, what their potential configurations are, what are the potential detection opportunities, we sometimes identify vulnerabilities within the cloud services themselves. And those vulnerabilities are of particular interest for an attacker because if you can compromise or abuse a cloud service, you may be able to pivot off of that and target other cloud customers and potentially steal data, access resources, and more. So to provide a little bit of an example of the types of cloud security research we conduct, as well as some of the vulnerabilities that we have found in cloud service providers, we wanted to provide a bit of a case study on a vulnerability that we found in AWS AppSync, which allowed us to cross that tenancy boundary and potentially access other customers' data. If you're not familiar, AWS AppSync is a quote, serverless GraphQL and PubSub API service. It allows you to very quickly and at scale build GraphQL APIs so that you can and tie them to your various AWS resources. So for example, if you wanted to build a GraphQL API that queried, say, DynamoDB, AppSync has all the tools necessary to build that very quickly, along with things like a schema builder. It'll create all the resources for you and more. It's certainly a very handy and easy to use service. As a research organization, we were particularly curious in how it worked and what the potential impacts of vulnerabilities within the service might be. So to sort of summarize how we conduct research on individual services, they're largely broken up into two phases. In phase one, we try to understand as much as we can about the service and how it works on a fundamental level. So reading documentation, building sort of test infrastructure, trying different configurations, getting an understanding of what the security impacts might be. And in building and testing this infrastructure, we noticed somewhat of an interesting way that AppSync worked. To provide sort of a high-level overview and oversimplify just a little bit, say, for example, in this slide, you're building an AppSync GraphQL API to interact with an S3 bucket. When a user makes a request to that GraphQL API, AppSync assume a role in the account and then perform whatever action you had set up or developed with that bucket. Now, what we noticed and what was interesting was that the default behavior of AppSync when it was creating a role was a trust relationship that just tied back to the AppSync service. And so the question becomes, okay, what happens if we try to ask AppSync to assume a role that we don't own in a different AWS account? This would be an example of a confused deputy problem or a confused deputy vulnerability, where a lower privileged entity, typically the attacker, is able to convince a higher privileged entity, in this case, AppSync, to perform some action that it probably doesn't actually want to perform. And so the question became, if we could convince AppSync to assume roles in other accounts, we might be able to get it to perform actions in those accounts and allow us to cross that tenancy boundary. Now, of course, when we tried to provide a role in a different account, we ran into errors. AWS did the exact same threat modeling that we did and came to the same conclusion that to specify arbitrary roles, that would have pretty significant security impacts. And indeed, you would get this error that says cross-account pass role is not allowed, which, to be fair, not surprising in the least. We expected this to happen. The question now becomes, how do we get around that validation? And how do we try and trick the AppSync service to assume arbitrary roles? Now, of course, taking a look at the actual API here, we were very focused in on trying to bypass that validation via weird role ARNs that we would construct, or trying different Unicode to try and hopefully get past the validation. But what we realized after a bit of work was that we were focusing on the wrong part. Rather than the actual role ARN payload that's being passed to the API, we became interested in the key, the JSON key of that element. In particular, we noticed that sort of an odd behavior of the API was that the API would accept content with JSON keys that were case insensitive. So you could pass, say, service role ARN in all uppercase, all lowercase, or some mix of that. As long as it wasn't the expected case, you would be able to create resources just fine. You would go through totally as if you had done nothing different. And so in this example here in the slides, we can see that by passing in with the normal casing a role that is not in that account, we get that 403 forbidden and the cross-account pass role is not allowed warning or error message. But if we instead pass it in as all lowercase or some odd or different casing, the request would actually go through just fine. We get back a 200 OK, and it would act as if we had provided a role in the same AWS account. To further demonstrate this, if we take a look at the bottom in the response, the data source ARN and the service role ARN are from two separate AWS accounts, further demonstrating that we were able to bypass that validation and were able to specify arbitrary roles in other AWS accounts. And so what the impact of this is that because of this vulnerability, we could now select any IEM role, which had a trust relation with AppSync service, and ask AppSync to assume that role on our behalf and perform actions in that account, including accounts that we didn't own or have any authority to interact with. And so what you're seeing here is us creating a request mapping template within AppSync, and we're asking it to perform the DynamoDB scan operation, which to simplify just a little bit, just basically dumps the contents of a DynamoDB table for us. And from there, we could query our own AppSync resources, but tied to that external role that we didn't own, and it would perform those actions in that account. So what you're seeing on the right in that screenshot is us being able to dump a database that wasn't in our account, wasn't one that we owned, and would allow us to or at least not one that we owned for demonstration purposes, but that would allow us to dump the contents of a database across account. And so from a, obviously this is not intended functionality. This is not exactly something that we want to see. And so we immediately created a short report and summary with technical details on the research that we conducted, how we were able to pull it off. We provided a proof of concept script to build all the infrastructure for you. And within just a few days, AWS was able to push a patch to fix the issue and mitigate the issue that we had identified.
Nick, one question here. What about informing internal teams while the disclosure process? Are you allowed to do it, or are there any precautions you have to make?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in general, obviously, we don't want it to be, we don't want to put it in a public Slack channel or something like that, make everyone aware of it. But we do notify internal consumers about this potential risk to both identify, have we seen this activity in our own environments that might be of impact, or have we seen this behavior in customer environments, and can we potentially notify a customer that we have identified this? But we also can notify internal security teams to either build detections or try and prevent it. It's just a matter of keeping, on an absolute need-to-know basis so that it doesn't potentially leak before there is a fix. Now, one question you might be wondering is, is there any way that this could have been prevented as a customer? The problem with zero-day vulnerabilities in the cloud is that oftentimes you don't have a lot of tools in order to mitigate them or to prevent abuse. In this situation, because it was a example of a confused deputy attack, there actually is an opportunity or a method by which you can mitigate that potential risk. Within the IAM, I suppose you call it a schema, there is a method by which you can use two condition operators, the AWS source account and the AWS source ARN condition keys. What these do are they evaluate prior to the role assumption if the caller is of a particular AWS account or a particular ARN. And so in this situation, if you had applied this condition, it would have prevented AppSync from making that request cross account. Now, of course, the challenge here is that this was not the default behavior of AppSync. This is something that you would have to proactively add, but it's something to keep in mind if you're using a particular service or one that is of particular importance to your workloads and your environment. If you have a particular reason to, you can deploy these conditions to mitigate that risk. And that pretty much covers our major focuses of research, trying to identify threats and vulnerabilities that an adversary can use against not just our customers, but also Datadog itself. The challenging part, of course, is that this is the easy part, identifying these things. The challenging part is actually trying to mitigate them. And so for that, I'll hand it over to Adam to talk a bit about how we scale this at Datadog and try and address it for ourselves.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. So, hello, my name is Adam. I am a member of the platform security team here at Datadog. And one of our daily responsibilities is to basically deal with the cloud misconfigurations. So my team has like 10 people where we are working across different parts of the stack. And when we are dealing with the cloud misconfigurations, we basically identified a couple of challenges, or I would call it building blocks, that we use to actually deal with them. These are divided into things that we consider to be cultural or the business environment specific, and then purely technical. Starting with the first problem, usually when you encounter the cloud misconfiguration, the first thing that after you validate it is that, okay, who do I need to contact? So who can actually fix this? Basically, who is the owner of the misconfiguration, or who is responsible for it? Challenges that we were facing were basically, when should we actually start dealing with this, like the ownership model, and how do we keep it up to date? Possible reasons that can lead to this problem basically starts and the company is pretty much any scale, but there are a couple of them. First, there is a lack of major processes such as service lifecycle management and team lifecycle management. Lack of service lifecycle means that basically people just create new services, but there is no thinking around who should be the owner, or thinking like how to identify these kind of questions. Around the team lifecycle, it's basically around the fact that in the bigger engineering companies, team usually they split, merge, reorganize, rename, and keeping all of these changes up to track is basically quite challenging. And apart from that, there also might be business priorities and needs, basically stating that companies want to focus on delivering product first and then dealing with the procedures. In Datadog, we identified this to be as one of the bigger challenges, and our approach was basically pretty simple. We created a company-wide initiative, which actually spawned multiple teams, such as platform security or security engineering, then the compliance teams, and also the infrastructure teams. What we settled in was that defining ownership became part of the service lifecycle, where basically every time the new service gets created, basically service is given a tag, and the ownership has to be clearly defined, and all cloud resources have to be tagged. And as a technical solution, we are basically using our own service catalog, which is basically a single source of truth. So any information about Datadog internal services should be contained within the service catalog. Going forward with the process, we also need to think, how do we actually scale this across the engineering teams? Platform security stakeholders are basically any product teams which basically deal with infrastructure or develop things. So they might not necessarily be the most skilled or have an amount of time to basically dig deeper into fixing this misconfiguration. So the challenging that we are basically facing here is that we need to provide the golden path so they can easily fix and correct those misconfigurations. And also identifying that misconfiguration has to be extremely simple and cannot take a lot of time. The way how we deal with this in Datadog was that we are basically trying to provide dashboards and tooling for our stakeholders. So we basically have run experiments with stakeholders up to the point where identifying the misconfigurations takes less than 30 seconds. On these dashboards, we are trying to provide contextual information such as location, like where is the vulnerability or the misconfiguration deployed, like which account, what is the type, impact, severity, and especially important for the leadership is the long-term data, such as trending, because this basically shows how well the team is doing. This is important, especially in bigger companies where fixing cloud misconfiguration can take between days and weeks.
Yeah, Adam, I think one common question the audience might be wondering is, how do you keep up with misconfigurations in new services? So when cloud service provider offers some new service and developers want to use it, what is the best way that's been found to try and identify those potential risks or misconfiguration earlier on?
Yeah, that's a good question, Nick. So I will be talking about that in the next section, but basically we are having an internal cloud asset inventory where we collect all the relevant information about all the assets from Datadog. So if you see that you discover the vulnerability within AppSync, then this asset inventory should allow you to answer the AppSync. If AppSync is used, it should be there. Going forward with the process, is pretty simple. Basically, we always iterated with the stakeholder, involved them early in the design, as they were the ones dealing with the process. Last but not least, important thing is to say is that all of as the remediation progresses and was more major, you also start to get a lot of valuable data, and this data, if analyzed properly, can show where to put engineering effort and prioritize the remediation work. How does such process look like? The process is rather simple. So basically, it focuses on identifying your resources, correcting the findings with the highest severity. So for example, we're starting with criticals, and then you would fix them. Once you fix all the criticals, you would repeat the process for high severity, the medium, and low, basically trying to reduce them to the 0. Here I'm also providing some example of the internal dashboards where we are providing contextual information. And what is extremely beneficial on this dashboard is that people can choose different dimensions or opportunities that how they can actually break down the findings, and this actually gives them the visibility that they are interested in. So for example, if you want to know if you have a vulnerability or misconfiguration within PC environment, you would just select the proper fields and you would get the answer in a matter of seconds. Going forward with the cloud asset inventory, this is basically related, Nick, to your question. So basically you stated the question correctly. Challenges here, basically every company defines the asset differently. For some, it can be just the service. For other, it can be S3 bucket, security group, auto-scaling group, and so on. Another big thing when people are not sure where to start, if they actually need it, and if the assets should be tagged. The way how we dealt with in Datadog was that we have our own CSPM solution, and we are leveraging data because we know that the data is analyzed for the resources, and we are collecting this information. And this data is then interconnected with service catalog. In two important things here is that this is basically, we consider this system to be a single source of truth, and this system is updated on a regular basis. So if teams deploy their changes, then they will be picked up and added to the registry or inventory itself. Going fast forward to the detections. So now this is basically becoming of the technical part. Question here we always get, how do we detect particular misconfigurations? Usually people ask us which exact tools we are using. So basically we are using the open source tooling in general, though there are different challenges, and that's basically the finding severity might not necessarily be the business criticality. Let's say that I have a S3 bucket that is open to the world, but it doesn't mean that it is basically the highest priority thing that I should focus on. Another big thing is basically trying not to overload stakeholders with the information, because doing detections or plugging in new tools is rather simple. Problem is that every now and then when we are going to detect new things, we have to ask, are those detections provide the value to the end user or actually the stakeholder? And also, last but not least, like which stage should we detect issues on? So how do we deal with misconfiguration detection at Datadog? We are basically focusing shift left mindset, where basically we are trying to detect as early as possible within the development pipeline. So basically trying to prevent them and be proactive so they don't become a security incident. And basically I would just say that we scan as early as possible within the development lifecycle. So for the development and deployment detections, we are focusing on an infrastructure as code and CI pipelines. The benefit of focusing on this is that it serves as an immediate feedback loop to the development team. So if there are issues, we can provide feedback and they can actually act upon it. We are using mostly open source tools as mentioned. So we are huge users of Checo. We also use AWS IAM Access Analyzer and some in-house Rego tooling. Usually we run scans in two modes that we scan everything daily, the particular repository. So basically this is important that we are able to spot trends and analyze them over time. And then we also scan every pull request created. And we are basically publishing comments on those pull requests with the carefully picked checks. And the comments basically platform security team, we make it our responsibility to provide comprehensible information to the stakeholder, so they know how, if they don't understand the vulnerability or the misconfiguration, we want to explain it. So basically provide them link to the resource, what it is, how it can be abused, and how to actually fix it. One of those examples of such misconfiguration is displayed on the picture. So we are analyzing Terraform code, and basically the finding description is posted on the particular comments or the lines within the pull request where the line actually, where the code, the change actually happens. And there are links to the remediation, link to the dashboard to basically, if people want to see for more findings, and the feedback if they need help, which will redirect them to our internal Slack channel. Going forward with the runtime detections. So detecting misconfiguration and runtime is quite important, because this basically focuses on analyzing the live cloud configuration for security security issues. It should be no surprise that we are using our own CSPM solution. As a cloud security practitioner, reason why I like it is that some of the rules are focused on immediate risk reduction. And apart from these rule sets, we are also using compliance ones that come with the product. Apart from CSPM, we are also using Cloud Custodian, which basically is an open source project that can actually help in detections, and actually you can write policies in a fast and easy way. We are using Cloud Custodian for in-house rules, especially that are kind of business specific and do not fit the general product. And one of the other reasons we also like is that it also provides us an ad hoc monitoring capability. So imagine that we have a security incident and we need to collect list of resources or write a simple detection rule, then it takes a matter of minutes and we can run it against the whole infrastructure, which is like 50 plus cloud, around 100, more than 100 cloud accounts. Next big thing that we have been focusing on has been prevention. So with the successful detection, we also want to move more to be a proactive. So we would like issues from preventing from happening. And the question we always ask ourselves after a security incident or after we detect new misconfigurations, how do we prevent them from happening? The challenges here are there are so many different misconfigurations that we could work on. So we need to find a way how to actually prioritize them to basically justify time spent on fixing them. And also which stage we want to focus on, because we can focus on runtime, but at some point it can be too late because the change already has been deployed. At the same time, we would like to focus on development process so people can see issue as soon as possible. So it actually is, the change doesn't get deployed. So as part of the development security or the basically prevention in development phase, we are trying to use the Terraform module. So pretty much they are a building block of our internal infrastructure. What we are doing as a platform security, we are trying to enhance them with the secure default. So for example, let's say that some developer wants to deliver or deploy S3 bucket. We make sure that the bucket deployed comes with a secure defaults. Another big thing is our internal knowledge base, which basically collects resources from different sources, and we are redirecting them people or basically linking them in particular findings. And one interesting concept we were playing at the hackathon was basically providing code suggestions to developers so they can actually commit them. We had an internal hackathon a couple of months ago, and we were basically pairing with an internal offensive security team where we were trying to figure out how much effort, how much work actually is required to basically develop such things. On the picture, you can see that we have posted code suggestions to GitHub, and GitHub interface allows us to basically commit commit the suggestion with the one click, and this basically could be seen as a one-click remediation if you are able to detect the malicious pattern. Challenge or problem with this approach is that usually you have to write your own rules and checks, which basically can take a lot of development time. And that's something that should always be seen through cost benefit comparison. Runtime prevention at Datadog. So we also focus on this one. So we are running our own in-house service called Automated Enforcement. This is a service that's running across all cloud providers Datadog is using. And with the service works in a very simple way, that basically it's listened to auditing events such as CloudTrail, Stackdriver, or Azure audit events. And let's say that there is an open bucket created, and event is then therefore audit event is will trigger the remediation action, which will basically revert the insecure configuration. So over the years of running the service, we found that it's rather hard to extend. So now we are trying to build the next generation on top of Cloud Custodian, which we started deploying last quarter. The reason why we went for is that it provides us the exact same benefits as the automated enforcement, though maintenance is much easier, and it offers us a lot more extension options. And apart from remediation, it also can be used for another use cases such as maintenance tasks or even compliance reporting. So overall, it's a pretty versatile tool that any organization should adopt if they want to do operations at scale. So, summary.
Yeah, so in summary, there are a wide variety of threats and vulnerabilities that may impact an organization. This takes a significant amount of time for security research team here at Datadog to identify those and continue to track new ones as they emerge. Additionally, it's worth noting that in some cases, we may be able to mitigate even zero-day vulnerabilities in cloud service providers by focusing on defense in depth and using all the controls that the cloud service providers offer us.
Yeah, on our side as a platform security recommendations, most organizations are very good at detecting misconfigurations, though the remediation efforts are severely lagging, and therefore it is very important to work on prioritizing the remediation efforts as well, so the issues actually get fixed in a timely manner. When it comes to remediation efforts, it is very good to start small in the beginning. So let's start with a very small process. You shouldn't be afraid to iterate, and you should always involve stakeholders early because they are providing valuable feedback and they help you develop the process in a way that suits them. And for us, this was an extremely valuable experience. And last but not least, also, don't be afraid to experiment and reuse the existing tooling as much as possible. For example, with Cloud Custodian, we were able to use it for more than we wanted. And it also actually enabled new use cases and still makes it simple to use because we are using one tool instead of dedicated tools, which can make it complicated. Going forward, here are resources, and now is the question time.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks both of you for the very thorough review of how we handle different types of threats and vulnerabilities inside of Datadog. We had a few questions come in, and just a reminder to the audience, we're only here with these guys for just a few more minutes. So if you have questions, definitely get those in the Q&A box. Otherwise, I think the first question that we have, it came in for Nick, which is, hey, I want to be a cloud security researcher. How should I get started?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. I personally started almost as a hobby while working as a penetration tester. Just on the side, I was researching AWS and various attacks and vulnerabilities in AWS itself. So there's definitely a lot of different ways that you can get started. I think the best advice I would have would be to try to get familiar with how AWS works, like under the hood. So how are API requests signed? What does the general format look like? As well as being mindful of more cloud-specific risks and issues. So it's great to find sort of common OWASP top 10 type web vulnerabilities. They certainly can be present even in cloud service providers, but be mindful of opportunities for things like confused deputy attacks by confusing services and using those to attack them, or vulnerabilities in core functionality of the service. So like IEM, or if you could perhaps bypass CloudTrail. All of those would be certainly very impactful for cloud security research.
Great, thanks. I think that gives a bit of a starting point. For Adam, I had a question come in about your comment on reusing tools. And I think this is something that people don't think about in smaller organizations, because we all have our bag of tricks, so to speak, with regard to the tools that we like to use. But why would you say that reusing tooling is better than having a single purpose dedicated tool for everything?
Oh, coming from my own, that's a good question. Thank you. Coming from my experience, basically over time, I realized one thing, that example as a detection ecosystem, all tools are able to detect pretty much the same misconfigurations. For example, compliance packs, or they're focusing. And the point is that people would go and they would pick new tool for pretty much new detections, but in the end, they would end up with 20 or 30 detection tools, which is not bad because you have a more extensive coverage. But what's problem from my experience was that when you start going through those findings, you start to see that they are basically pretty much duplications, meaning that it adds to the noise. So my recommendation is basically try to see if you can find a tool. Lately, I have been playing with, for example, SemGrep. SemGrep is a static analyzer and it's pretty configurable. Most people are not using it for cloud security things, but at the same time, there are rule sets to do that. People, when it comes to the detecting cloud security issues, they would be using dedicated tools for this. But the message also here should be that people should not be afraid to dig deeper and basically see what if the tool is actually providing the value, because just the fact that the tool does many different things doesn't mean that it provides value on its own, and people should be focusing more going through the capabilities, like what the tool actually can do.
Well, thanks for that very thorough answer. And I think SemGrep actually came up 3 times in the presentation, once as part of GuardDog, once as part of the automated checks that you were doing, and now again as a recommendation. Definitely a great tool to put in the toolbox. With that, though, I want to thank you both for being here on this episode of Datadog On. Keep an eye out for upcoming episodes of Datadog On, and we hope to see you back for another great episode. Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Andrew. Have a good day.